Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome back to this ongoing discussion of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. How are y'all doing at this point? If you are following along with the same reading schedule I am, listed down below in the description box, you may be celebrating with me that we are significantly more than a third of the way through this very long novel. In the version I'm reading, Book 6, also called Volume 2, Part 3, we end on something like page 530. Progress. I guess this is silly, but as I've said many times before, I get intimidated when books are more than about 700 pages. Somehow my celebration of how much we've read so far is allowing me to restart the clock a bit. And the amount of book left at this point is very close to the number of pages that no longer make me feel nervous. Well, this week's section is fairly short. The book starts, perhaps surprisingly, with Tsar Alexander and Napoleon Bonaparte temporarily becoming allies against Austria. Tolstoy tells the reader this information quickly, almost as if it isn't important, even though he's also just told us that, quote, high society has much to say about the splendor of this important meeting. Instead, quote, life itself, the ordinary life of real people with their personal involvement in health and sickness, hard work and relaxation, their involvement in thought, science, poetry, music, love, friendship, enmity and passion, went on as usual, far removed from all political considerations, such as being for or against Napoleon, and all questions of reform. A bit of time has passed. Over the past 2 years, Prince Andrei has lived in the country and been active in reform efforts not wholly dissimilar to the efforts Pierre made in the section we talked about last week. The difference is that Andrei is successful. He has freed more than 300 serfs and shifted the system of forced labor to a system of rent payment. He had hired teachers and midwives for the community. As Tolstoy says, all the innovations introduced by Pierre on his estates without any concrete results because of the continuous flitting of one enterprise to another had been carried through by Prince Andrei privately and without any noticeable effort on his part. He possessed in the highest degree the one quality that Pierre totally lacked, the practical application to get things going with no fuss or struggle. This comparison between the reserved and almost haughty demeanor of Prince Andrei and the bumbling, uncontrolled kind of open-heartedness that Pierre expresses is a mirroring that happens throughout this chapter. Maybe I'm being slightly unfair here, actually. While Andrei does seem haughty, or at least depressed, in this particular book, we get to see a bit of thawing in his heart during this part. The imagery is just spectacular. Let me read here. There at the roadside stood an oak tree. It must have been 10 times older than the birch trees that made up the wood, 10 times as thick and twice the height of any of them. That tree was enormous. It would have taken 2 men to join hands around its girth, with branches broken off it ages ago, and its old, cracked bark all scarred and broken. There it stood among the beaming birches, with its great, gnarled hands sprawling out awkwardly and unevenly, a truculent, sneering monster. He alone refused to submit to the charms of spring. He would not countenance either spring or sunshine. The he here is the tree, but of course it's also a metaphor for Andrei. Springtime and love, he agrees with the old oak tree, are just shams, false hopes. He realizes that his only real goal is to live without doing any harm, and not to risk the kind of desires and hopes that can so easily end in heartbreak. Of course, within a page, Andrei has more or less abandoned his life as an old oak tree. He's looking through his coach window as he drives past a group of active and laughing girls. Quote, Out in front, dashing toward the coach, came a black-haired, black-eyed girl, quite remarkably slender in her yellow print dress, with a white handkerchief on her head and stray locks of loose hair tumbling out of it. This is, of course, the always dazzling Natasha. During the night, she and her companion are out again, under the trees again, looking at the moon. Andre can hear her through the bedroom window where he's staying. Quote, "And he was surprised to feel his spirit overwhelmed by a sudden surge of ideas and hopes that belonged to youth and clashed with his whole way of life." The old oak tree had been transformed. Life had come back to Andre. Spring had finally entered his heart, and spring had changed the actual tree too, as Andre soon sees. No trace now of the gnarled fingers, the scars, the old sadness and misgivings. Succulent young leaves with no twigs had burst straight through the hard bark of 100 years. It was almost incredible that this old fellow should have grown them. And with that, Andre is seemingly reborn, and he completely falls in love with Natasha. Pierre, meanwhile, manages to get himself in trouble with the Freemasons. In his efforts to be a leader, he travels and thinks and then proposes that the group support a universal government based on Christian principles. But the Freemasons reject him, thinking he is a radical or maybe a revolutionary. Right around this point, his estranged wife, Helene, of the heaving corset scene I read out a couple of weeks ago, asks if the two of them can try to reconcile. He still thinks she's stupid, but he seems to appreciate at least a few of her strengths now. But then he starts dreaming about sexual passion, and he's worried that he's becoming boorish and out of control. So here we have Andre coming back to life, spring sap rising in his limbs, and Pierre trying to make sure the sap doesn't rise uncontrollably in his own life. As I often feel in Tolstoy's book, it's fascinating to watch characters undergo these very internal changes. Both of the men seem to be fighting inner demons, or at least internal conflicts. Almost all the male characters seem to struggle with some kind of internal conflict. I'm not seeing that kind of complexity in many of the female characters, though. Perhaps I'm missing it, or perhaps Tolstoy assumes women are just more put together. Or perhaps he isn't as committed to drawing his female characters quite as deeply as he creates his men. I'll keep thinking about this issue, and I'd love to hear from you if you have any thoughts about it. Well, back to romance for a minute. At a society party, Andre and Natasha dance together, and Andre is totally smitten. Natasha is wearing her fancy clothes and is feeling beautiful. He explicitly thinks he might want to marry her. And then Andre visits her home the next day, where she's just her normal self, and he finds her even more beautiful than he thought she was when she was all dressed up. And she's interested in marrying him, too. The one problem? Andre's father thinks Natasha is too young and immature, and that she's not wealthy enough. Andre reaches a compromise. He will not marry her for 1 year, and he will be away for much of that period. As the two lovebirds say their goodbyes, he tells Natasha to befriend Pierre and to confide in him if she needs anything. I'm no relationship expert, but I have a feeling that this might be a terrible idea on Andre's part. Still, I think it points out something that's almost hard to remember sometimes. Just as it was surprising to see Alexander and Napoleon getting along at the beginning of the book, it's a little surprising to see how real and deep the relationship between Pierre and Andre is. They are true friends. Well, I think that will do it for today. For next week, we'll be reading 2 fairly short books or volumes. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.